A quiet morning disrupted. The sun was just beginning to rise over the small suburban town of Maplewood. Its rays bathed the streets in a golden glow, promising a beautiful day ahead. The local grocery store parking lot was already buzzing with life. Cars rolled in and out, shopping carts squeaked over the pavement, and the chatter of early risers filled the air. Among the activity, a tall, proud figure stood out. A black man dressed immaculately in a crisp military uniform adorned with medals that sparkled under the sunlight. This man was Marcus Brooks, a retired Army Master Sergeant. He had spent over 2 decades serving his country, leading men and women into battle, and safeguarding the freedoms others often took for granted. Despite his stature and the respect his uniform commanded, Marcus was a humble man. He was at the store that morning for a simple reason: to pick up supplies for a local veteran outreach program. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder contained pamphlets, registration forms, and small tokens of appreciation for veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. As Marcus approached the store entrance, he greeted passersby with a warm smile. Most responded kindly, but there was always the occasional glance of suspicion or discomfort. It was nothing new to him. He had long ago learned to navigate the biases that came with his skin color, even when clad in a uniform that should have symbolized unity and respect. The arrival of Officer Blake. From the far end of the parking lot, the growl of an engine drew attention. A police cruiser rolled in, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. Behind the wheel sat Officer Blake Thompson, a man whose reputation for aggressive behavior preceded him. Blake was known for his strict demeanor, but there was an undercurrent of tension whenever he was on duty. For some, he was the embodiment of authority. For others, he represented fear and prejudice. As the cruiser parked, Blake's eyes locked onto Marcus almost immediately. Something about the sight of a black man in a decorated military uniform seemed to set him on edge. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, and a scowl etched itself onto his face. Blake stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the asphalt. His body language was rigid, radiating an energy that made nearby shoppers pause. He adjusted his utility belt and approached Marcus, his eyes narrowed and assessing. The medals on Marcus's chest caught the light, momentarily blinding Blake, but instead of inspiring admiration, they seemed to irritate him further. "What's going on here?" Blake called out, his tone sharp and loud enough to turn heads. Marcus turned toward the voice, his expression calm but alert. His years of military service had taught him how to read people, and he could sense the hostility in Blake's approach. Remaining composed, Marcus replied, "Good morning, officer. Just picking up supplies for a veteran program downtown." Blake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze sweep over Marcus, scrutinizing him in a way that felt more invasive than protective. "A veteran program, huh?" he finally said, his tone laced with skepticism. "What's with the uniform? Some kind of costume?" Tension builds. The question hung in the air like a bad smell. Nearby shoppers began to take notice, their conversations fading into silence as they watched the exchange. Marcus's posture remained relaxed, but his voice carried a quiet strength as he responded, "This isn't a costume, officer. It's my uniform. I served 22 years in the United States Army." Blake let out a short, derisive laugh. 22 years, huh? That's a long time. Got any proof of that claim?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, but remained unflappable. "Proof? Are you asking for my service record?" Blake's smirk widened as he crossed his arms. "I'm asking for some ID. You know, to make sure you're not pulling a fast one. Stolen valor is a crime, after all." The word struck a nerve with some onlookers, and a murmur rippled through the small crowd that had begun to form. Marcus could see the disbelief and indignation in their faces, but he didn't let it affect his response. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and produced a military ID card, handing it to Blake. Blake snatched the card without a word, flipping it over as if expecting to find some glaring flaw. His eyes narrowed as he read the information. Marcus Brooks, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired. The photo matched Marcus perfectly, but Blake wasn't ready to back down. "Hemph," Blake muttered, handing the card back. "You could have made this at home for all I know." The crowd takes notice. The murmur among the onlookers grew louder. A woman in her 40s whispered to her friend, "That's Marcus Brooks. My husband's in the veteran program he runs. He's a good man." Her friend nodded, her expression a mixture of confusion and anger. Blake seemed to sense the shifting atmosphere but doubled down. "What's in the bag?" he asked, pointing to Marcus's duffel. "You carrying anything you shouldn't be?" Marcus's patience was wearing thin, but he maintained his composure. "The bag contains supplies for the Veteran Outreach Program," he said evenly. "Blankets, canned goods, and paperwork." Blake sneered. "Mind if I take a look?" "Just to be sure." Without hesitation, Marcus set the bag down and stepped back. "Go ahead, officer. You won't find anything dangerous." Blake crouched down, unzipping the bag with exaggerated care. The contents were exactly as Marcus had described: neatly folded blankets, canned food, and documents. The officer's face twitched, his confidence faltering for the briefest moment before he snapped the bag shut. "Well," Blake said, standing up and adjusting his belt, "looks like you've got your story straight." A voice of support. Before Marcus could respond, a voice called out from the crowd, "Sergeant Brooks." A middle-aged man stepped forward, his face lighting up with recognition. "You helped me last year when I was struggling to get back on my feet. I wouldn't have my job today if it weren't for you." The man's words sparked a chain reaction. Others in the crowd began to speak up, sharing their own stories of how Marcus had helped them or someone they knew. Blake's jaw tightened as he realized the tide was turning against him. He glanced around, noticing several smartphones pointed in his direction, recording every second of the interaction. Marcus turned to the crowd, his calm expression never wavering. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Then, turning back to Blake, he added, "Officer, it seems we're drawing a lot of attention. Maybe it's time to de-escalate this situation." The first crack in Blake's armor. Blake's face reddened, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. For a moment, he looked as though he might lash out, but the weight of the crowd's judgment held him in check. He took a step back, his hand hovering near his radio as though considering calling for backup. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence, his uniform, and the support of the crowd spoke louder than any words could. The tension hung thick in the air, the next move belonging to Blake, and whatever it was, it would define the moment. The weight of assumptions. Blake Thompson stood frozen for a moment, his hand hovering near his belt, where his radio and holstered gun sat. The crowd's eyes burned into him, their collective gaze making the small parking lot feel like a courtroom. The murmurs had turned into louder whispers, the air thick with judgment. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This moment was spiraling into something far larger than Blake had anticipated. The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, his composure cracking. Despite his authoritative stance, the pressure of public scrutiny was something he hadn't anticipated. His training had prepared him for physical threats, not for the quiet, commanding presence of someone like Marcus Brooks. Someone who could dismantle his assumptions without ever raising his voice. A question of character. Marcus remained calm, his eyes steady on Blake. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was something even more piercing. Disappointment. Marcus had seen men crumble under far greater pressures in war zones, and this officer's bravado felt shallow in comparison. He chose his next words carefully, knowing they could either diffuse or ignite the situation further. "Officer Thompson," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm, "do you know what these medals mean?" He gestured to the ribbons and decorations gleaming on his chest. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. I'm sure they mean something to you," he muttered, his tone defensive. Marcus took a step closer, his presence commanding but non-threatening. They mean years of service, he said evenly. They mean sacrifices you'll never have to make because of men and women like me. Every one of these medals represents lives saved, missions completed, and a commitment to something bigger than myself. The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes darting between Marcus and Blake. Someone in the back called out, "Show some respect." Another added, "He's earned those medals." Blake's jaw tightened. "I'm not disrespecting you," he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just doing my job." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Your job," he repeated, the words measured. "Is your job to question every veteran who walks into a grocery store, or is your job to serve and protect all people, regardless of how they look?" The power of silence. The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence grew louder, punctuated only by the faint sounds of cars passing on the nearby street. It wasn't just Marcus waiting for an answer. It was the entire crowd. Marcus folded his arms across his chest, his stance unyielding. "I've been in situations where a single decision could mean the difference between life and death," he said, his voice calm but penetrating. "And I learned that hesitation, pride, and assumptions can cost lives. Right now, Officer Thompson, you have a choice to make. Will you let pride dictate your actions, or will you rise to the occasion?" Blake's face flushed red, his grip tightening on his utility belt. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public. Yet, something about Marcus's presence made it impossible to simply brush him off. Marcus wasn't angry, he was resolute. And that, more than anything, made Blake uneasy. "The community speaks." "Hey, officer," a voice called out, breaking the tension. A young man stepped forward, his smartphone held high, recording the encounter. "You know who this guy is? He's the one who helped my uncle get into rehab after he came back from Afghanistan. My uncle was ready to give up on life, and Sergeant Brooks pulled him back from the edge." Another voice joined in, this time from a middle-aged woman. "My husband wouldn't have a job if it weren't for Marcus. He helped him write his resume, drove him to interviews, and even gave him food when we couldn't afford groceries." The testimonies came one after another, the voices of the crowd amplifying each other. Blake's confidence wavered further as he realized he wasn't just facing Marcus. He was facing an entire community that stood behind him. The weight of their words pressed down on Blake, eroding the authority he thought he had. The crack in the armor. Blake's hand fell away from his belt as he took an involuntary step back. His chest heaved as he struggled to find the right words. I didn't mean to cause a scene," he stammered, his voice lacking the conviction it had carried earlier. "I was just trying to do my job." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. The officer's attempt to justify his actions felt hollow against the overwhelming tide of support for Marcus. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were openly voicing their disapproval. "Do your job," someone shouted. "Your job is to protect, not harass. You're the one causing the scene," another added. Blake's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He looked around, as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. The eyes of the crowd, and the lenses of countless smartphones, were fixed on him. A lesson in leadership. Marcus took a deep breath, his tone softening but losing none of its strength. "Officer Thompson," he said, "I've led men and women into battles where we couldn't afford to make mistakes. We had to trust each other, no matter where we came from or what we looked like. That trust saved lives. But trust isn't given, it's earned." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You wear a badge that represents trust. But today, you've shown this community that trust is not something you value. I hope, for your sake and theirs, that you take this opportunity to reflect and do better." Blake's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the moment finally breaking through his defenses. He nodded stiffly but said nothing, his eyes downcast. The turning point. The crowd began to clap, a slow, deliberate applause that started with one person and quickly spread. It wasn't just a show of support for Marcus. It was a message to Blake, a reminder of the accountability he now faced. Marcus turned to the crowd, his expression one of quiet determination. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing them directly. "It's about all of us. If we allow prejudice and assumptions to go unchecked, they'll continue to divide us. But if we stand together, if we demand accountability, we can create a community where everyone is treated with respect." The applause grew louder, echoing across the parking lot. Blake stood awkwardly to the side, his face a mixture of embarrassment and regret. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand the gravity of his actions. As Marcus picked up his duffel bag and turned toward the store, the crowd parted to let him through. Some reached out to shake his hand. Others patted him on the back, their gratitude palpable. Blake watched in silence, his earlier bravado now completely gone. It wasn't just a lesson for Blake. It was a moment that the entire community would remember. And for Marcus, it was another battle won in the ongoing fight for respect and equality. The breaking point. The parking lot, once alive with casual conversations and the hum of everyday life, had transformed into a tense theater of accountability. Marcus Brooks stood at the center, his military uniform catching the sunlight like armor, his presence commanding respect. Around him, a growing crowd murmured with a mixture of admiration and indignation. Officer Blake Thompson, meanwhile, shifted uneasily under the weight of the collective gaze. His earlier confidence had eroded, replaced by a visible unease that betrayed his struggle to maintain control. Blake's hand twitched near his belt, but it wasn't a gesture of authority this time. It was a nervous tick, a sign of a man out of his depth. He had entered this situation confident in his assumptions, but the narrative had spiraled beyond his control. The crowd wasn't on his side, and the man he had tried to demean wasn't breaking under pressure. If anything, Marcus seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The call for accountability. "Officer Thompson," Marcus said, breaking the silence that had settled over the scene. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to his voice that made it impossible to ignore. "I've answered your questions. I've provided my ID. I've even allowed you to search my bag. What exactly are you still looking for?" Blake's jaw tightened, his eyes darting around the crowd as if searching for support. But there was none. Instead, he saw faces filled with disapproval, their judgment cutting deeper than any words could. I was just doing my job," Blake stammered, his voice lacking the conviction it once held. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Doing your job," he repeated. "Tell me, Officer Thompson, what part of your job involves questioning the integrity of a man in uniform? Is it your job to assume the worst about someone based on how they look?" Blake opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "No, let me rephrase that," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "What is it about me that made you assume I didn't belong in this uniform? Was it the color of my skin, or was it something else?" The question landed like a hammer blow, and the crowd reacted instantly. A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers, many nodding in solidarity. Someone in the back called out, "Answer him." Another shouted, "Yeah, what's your excuse?" Blake's face flushed a deep red. He looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, his discomfort palpable. I didn't assume anything," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I was just being cautious." The power of stories. A voice broke through the tension. A woman in her 50s, her tone firm but kind. "Cautious," she said, stepping forward. "This man isn't a threat. He's a hero. Marcus Brooks helped my son when no one else would. After my boy came back from Iraq, he couldn't sleep, couldn't work, couldn't even leave the house. But Marcus showed up at our door, unannounced, with a job application in one hand and groceries in the other. He gave my son hope when even I had given up." Her words hit the crowd like a tidal wave, drawing murmurs of agreement. Another man chimed in, his voice filled with emotion. "He helped me too. I was living out of my car, couldn't find work, and thought about ending it all. Marcus gave me a place to stay, helped me get back on my feet. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. Blake's discomfort deepened. Each story chipped away at his authority, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were rallying behind Marcus, their collected voice growing louder with every passing second. Marcus takes control. Marcus held up a hand, quieting the crowd. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a weight that silenced even the most outspoken voices. "Thank you," he said, addressing the people who had spoken up. "Your words mean a lot to me. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about what we allow to happen in our communities." He turned back to Blake, his tone shifting to something softer yet no less powerful. "Officer Thompson, I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a product of a system that teaches people to fear what they don't understand. But that doesn't excuse your actions today. You had a choice to treat me with respect, or to let your assumptions guide you. And you chose the latter." Blake's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked as though he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. The crowd's eyes bore into him, their collective presence a silent demand for accountability. "The crowd demands action. You owe him an apology," a man shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Own up to what you did." Another voice joined in, this time a younger woman. "Yeah, say you're sorry. Or are you too proud to admit you're wrong?" The pressure mounted, the crowd's energy growing more intense. Blake looked around, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and frustration. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to being the one on trial, and the weight of the moment was crushing him. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low enough that only Blake could hear. "You can end this right now," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Apologize. Acknowledge your mistake. Show these people that you're capable of growth, or you can let your pride destroy what little trust they have left in you. The choice is yours. The first step toward redemption." Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry. His gaze shifted to Marcus, then to the crowd, and finally back to Marcus. The silence stretched, every second feeling heavier than the last. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, louder, "You're right. I was wrong." The crowd stilled, their collective breath held as they waited for him to continue. Blake's face was a mask of shame and regret, but there was a flicker of sincerity in his eyes. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did," he admitted. "I let my assumptions get the better of me, and for that I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Then, slowly, the crowd began to clap. It wasn't an uproarious applause, but it carried a sense of acknowledgement, a recognition that for the first time, Blake was taking a step in the right direction. Marcus nodded, extending a hand toward the officer. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. This is just the first step." Blake hesitated before taking Marcus's hand. The handshake was brief, but it carried more weight than any words could convey. As the crowd began to disperse, their voices a mix of approval and lingering frustration, Marcus knew this moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For Blake, for the community, and for the countless others who would hear about this story, the real work was yet to come. The turning tide. The tension in the air didn't dissipate with Blake's apology. It lingered, heavy and electric, as if the crowd was waiting for more. Marcus Brooks, standing tall in his decorated military uniform, looked at Officer Blake Thompson with an expression that was neither triumphant nor accusatory. It was a look of quiet determination, the kind that spoke of battles won through perseverance, not force. Blake, on the other hand, looked as though he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His apology had been brief, mumbled, and lacking the conviction the crowd was expecting. It had done little to repair the damage caused by his actions. The murmurs among the onlookers made it clear they weren't satisfied. To them, This wasn't just about an apology. It was about accountability, change, and justice. The crowd pushes back. "Is that all you've got to say?" A voice called out from the back. It was a young man holding his phone high, still recording the scene. "You think a half-hearted sorry is enough after the way you treated him?" A chorus of agreement followed, voices rising in unison. "Do better." One person shouted, "We need more than words." Another added. Blake's discomfort deepened, his gaze darting between Marcus and the crowd. He had entered the situation confident in his authority, but now he felt as if the badge on his chest was a target, not a shield. For the first time, he realized he wasn't in control, not of the situation, and certainly not of the narrative. Marcus stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. The murmurs subsided, but the energy remained palpable. "Let him speak," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying over the restless audience. "Let's see if he's willing to take real accountability." The struggle within. Blake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He felt cornered, exposed, and humiliated. Yet there was something about Marcus's steady gaze that compelled him to stay. This wasn't just about protecting his reputation anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of rising above his mistakes. Blake began, his voice shaky. He stopped, cleared his throat, and tried again. "I know I messed up. I shouldn't have questioned your integrity, especially not in front of everyone like this. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I failed to show the respect you deserve." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some nodded in approval, acknowledging the effort, while others crossed their arms, waiting for more. Blake felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, but he forced himself to continue. "I need to be better," he admitted, "not just as an officer, but as a person. And I promise I'll take steps to make that happen." Marcus's response. Marcus studied Blake for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a nod, he spoke. "Acknowledging your mistakes is a good first step, Officer Thompson. But words without action mean nothing. The people here," he gestured to the crowd, "aren't just looking for an apology. They want to see change. They want to know that the people sworn to protect them are worthy of their trust." Blake nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. "I understand," he said, "and I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back." "Good," Marcus replied. "Then let's start right here, right now. Use this moment to reflect on why you reacted the way you did. Was it fear? Prejudice? A lack of understanding? Whatever it was, confront it, learn from it, and make sure it never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." The lesson begins. The crowd fell silent, watching as Marcus stepped closer to Blake. The two men stood face to face, their differences stark, but their shared humanity undeniable. "You know," Marcus said, his voice softer now, "I've seen men face their greatest fears on the battlefield. I've seen them rise above their flaws and become better for it. But that transformation doesn't come easy. It takes courage, not the kind you show with a badge or a gun, but the kind that comes from within." Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know if I'm that kind of person," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Blake's shoulder. "You won't know until you try. The first step is admitting you were wrong. The next is making it right." A call to action. Turning to the crowd, Marcus addressed them directly. "This moment isn't just about one man's mistake," he said. "It's about all of us. It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to live in a place where fear and prejudice dictate our actions? Or do we want to create a space where everyone, regardless of their background, feels safe, respected, and valued?" The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the parking lot. Marcus raised a hand to quiet them, his voice firm but inclusive. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "It starts with conversations like this, uncomfortable as they may be. It starts with holding each other accountable, Not just the people in power, but ourselves. Blake looked at Marcus, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else. Hope. For the first time, he felt as though this moment, painful as it was, could be the start of something better. The promise of redemption. As the crowd began to disperse, their energy still charged with the events of the day, Marcus and Blake remained standing in the center of the parking lot. "What happens now?" Blake asked, his voice quiet but earnest. Marcus smiled faintly. "That's up to you," he said. "You have the power to decide what kind of officer and what kind of man you want to be. But remember this, every action you take from here on out will define that choice." Blake nodded, his resolve hardening. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady for the first time that day, "for giving me a chance to make things right." Marcus extended a hand, and this time, Blake took it without hesitation. The handshake was firm, a silent promise between two men determined to build a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching. Bridging the divide. The crowd had begun to thin, but the energy in the air remained electric, charged with the gravity of what had just unfolded. Marcus Brooks stood tall, his decorated uniform still gleaming in the sunlight, but his eyes were now softer as he regarded Officer Blake Thompson. The officer, whose confidence had crumbled under the weight of his actions, looked more human now, uncertain, even vulnerable. Blake's apology had been a start, but both men knew there was more to be done. Words were easy, action was harder. And as the remaining bystanders lingered, their smartphones still recording, Marcus decided to take the next step, not for himself, but for the sake of the community that had witnessed this moment. An invitation. "Officer Thompson," Marcus began, his voice carrying both authority and warmth, "I want to offer you something." Blake blinked, visibly caught off guard. "Offer me something," he echoed, his voice tinged with both confusion and caution. Marcus nodded. "Yes," he said. "An opportunity. Tomorrow, I'll be at the Veterans Outreach Center downtown. We're hosting a workshop on community building and leadership. It's open to anyone who wants to learn how to serve their community better. I think it would be a good place for you to start." Blake's brows furrowed as he processed the offer. The idea of voluntarily walking into a space where he might face judgment, or even hostility, was daunting. But the sincerity in Marcus's voice made it clear this wasn't a trap. It was a chance to rebuild, not just his reputation, but his understanding of the people he had sworn to protect. "Why would you want me there?" Blake asked cautiously. "Because growth starts with stepping outside your comfort zone," Marcus replied. "You made a mistake today, but you've also shown that you're willing to acknowledge it. That's the first step. The next is listening, really listening, to the people you serve." A crossroad. Blake looked down at the ground, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what Marcus was asking of him. Showing up at the outreach center meant more than facing Marcus again. It meant confronting the biases he had never fully acknowledged. It meant being vulnerable in front of people he had unknowingly wronged. The crowd, though smaller now, remained silent, watching the interaction with keen interest. Blake felt their eyes on him, their silent judgment pushing him toward a decision. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there." Marcus smiled faintly. "Good," he said. "I'll see you at 10 a.m. sharp." The role of the community. With Blake's tentative agreement, Marcus turned back to the crowd. "What happened here today isn't just about one officer and one veteran," he said, his voice strong and steady. "It's about what kind of community we want to build. It's about holding each other accountable, but it's also about offering each other grace and the chance to grow." The crowd murmured in agreement, their initial anger tempered by Marcus's calm authority. A woman near the front raised her hand, stepping forward hesitantly. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "how do we help? How do we make sure things like this don't keep happening?" Marcus regarded her with a thoughtful expression. "It starts with conversations," he said. Real, honest conversations about the things we don't want to talk about. Race, privilege, fear. It starts with standing up when we see injustice, but also with extending a hand when someone is willing to change. He glanced at Blake, who was listening intently, his face a mixture of guilt and determination. And it starts with recognizing that we all have the capacity to grow, no matter how far we've fallen. A shift in perspective. The remaining members of the crowd began to nod, their expressions softening as they absorbed Marcus's words. Some approached him to shake his hand or thank him for his service. Others turned to Blake, offering tentative words of encouragement. One man, a retired firefighter, placed a hand on Blake's shoulder and said, "Takes guts to admit when you're wrong. Keep at it." Blake looked at the man, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had expected ridicule, anger, and disdain, but instead, he was met with something unexpected: understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The day after. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the outreach center early, as he always did. The small building was modest but welcoming, its walls adorned with photographs of local veterans and community leaders. Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and preparing for the day's activities. Marcus greeted each of them with a smile, his presence a steadying force. At exactly 10 a.m., the front door opened, and Blake stepped inside. He wasn't in uniform. Instead, he wore plain clothes that made him look more approachable, less authoritative. His face was etched with apprehension, but he squared his shoulders and walked up to Marcus. "You're on time," Marcus said with a nod of approval. "That's a good start." Blake managed a small smile. "Didn't want to mess up my second chance." Marcus gestured toward a group of chairs arranged in a circle. "Come on, let's get started." The workshop. The room slowly filled with people, veterans, community members, and even a few other police officers who had heard about the previous day's events. The workshop began with introductions, each person sharing their story and why they had come. When it was Blake's turn, he hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I'm here because I made a mistake," he said finally. "I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." His words were met with a mixture of nods and quiet encouragement. Marcus, sitting directly across from him, gave a small nod of approval, but said nothing, allowing the moment to belong to Blake. The discussions that followed were raw and unfiltered. People shared their experiences with prejudice, fear, and resilience. Veterans spoke about the challenges of reintegration, while community members talked about the importance of trust between law enforcement and the people they serve. Blake listened intently, his earlier defensiveness replaced by genuine curiosity. For the first time, he began to see the world through the eyes of those he had sworn to protect. And as the day went on, something shifted within him, a realization that his badge wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a responsibility, a step toward change. By the end of the day, Blake approached Marcus, his expression one of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the chance to be here. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm ready to do the work." Marcus smiled, extending his hand. "That's all anyone can ask for," he said. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being better than you were yesterday." The handshake was firm, a silent promise between two men on a journey toward understanding and growth. And as they stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a community united in their desire for change, it became clear that this moment was more than just an ending. It was a beginning, a new path forward. The outreach center buzzed with quiet energy as the day wound to a close. Conversations lingered in the air like the scent of fresh coffee, a mix of voices sharing stories, hopes, and plans for the future. Marcus Brooks stood near the front of the room, watching as the last of the workshop participants exchanged handshakes and farewells. Officer Blake Thompson lingered by the door, his expression thoughtful, as if weighing the weight of the day's events. The day had been transformative, not just for Blake, but for everyone involved. The workshop had been raw and emotional, filled with difficult conversations and moments of self-reflection. Yet, amidst the vulnerability, there was also a sense of solidarity, a shared determination to move forward as a community, a reflection on growth. As the room emptied, Marcus approached Blake, his presence as steady and grounding as ever. "You did well today," Marcus said, his voice low but warm. "It's not easy to sit in a room like that and listen, especially when the stories hit close to home." Blake looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's. There was no trace of the defensiveness or arrogance that had marked their first encounter. Instead, there was a quiet humility, a man trying to reconcile who he had been with who he wanted to become. "It wasn't easy," Blake admitted, his voice soft. "Hearing some of those stories, realizing how much pain and distrust people feel toward people like me, it hit harder than I expected." Marcus nodded, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. "Acknowledging that pain is the first step. It's not your fault that distrust exists, but it is your responsibility to help rebuild that trust. That's what being a public servant is about." Blake let the words sink in, his gaze drifting to the floor. "I used to think wearing this badge was enough," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "That just by showing up, I was doing my job. But I realize now it's so much more than that. It's about earning the trust of the people I'm supposed to protect." Marcus studied him for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're starting to get it," he said. "The badge is just a symbol. What matters is how you choose to wear it." The ripple effect. As they spoke, a young woman approached hesitantly. She was one of the workshop attendees, a teacher who had shared her story of being unfairly profiled during a traffic stop. Her voice had been one of the most powerful in the room, shaking with both anger and hope as she recounted her experience. "Officer Thompson," she said, her tone tentative but sincere, "I just wanted to say thank you for listening today, for being here. It means a lot to know you're willing to change." Blake looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady, "for sharing your story. It opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect." The woman nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "That's all we ask for. That you see us. Really see us." As she walked away, Blake turned back to Marcus. "She's right," he said. "For too long, I've been looking at people without really seeing them. That has to change." A community united. Outside the center, the sun was setting, casting the streets of the small town in hues of orange and gold. Marcus and Blake stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of the day giving way to a quiet sense of accomplishment. For Marcus, it was another step in a lifetime of service. For Blake, it was the beginning of a journey he had never expected to take. "I have to ask," Blake said as they walked toward the parking lot, "why did you give me a chance? After everything I said and did, you could have written me off. Most people would have." Marcus stopped, his gaze steady as he turned to face Blake. "Because I've seen what happens when we give up on people," he said simply. "I've seen good men make bad choices, and I've seen them turn their lives around when someone believed in them. You made a mistake, but you also showed the courage to own up to it. That's worth something." Blake nodded, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him like a warm blanket. "I'm not sure I deserve that kind of faith," he admitted. "Maybe not yet," Marcus replied with a faint smile. "But that's the beauty of it. You get to earn it. A plan for the future." Before parting ways, Marcus handed Blake a flyer for the outreach center. "We have meetings every week," he said. "Veterans, community leaders, even a few police officers come by to talk about ways we can work together to make this town better. You should join us." Blake accepted the flyer, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. "I'll be there," he promised. "I owe it to this town, and to myself, to do better." Marcus extended his hand, and Blake shook it firmly. The handshake was a silent agreement, a shared commitment to the work that lay ahead. As Blake walked to his car, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The lasting impact. In the days and weeks that followed, word of the incident and its aftermath spread throughout the community. Videos of the parking lot confrontation went viral, sparking conversations about prejudice, accountability, and the power of second chances. The outreach center saw an influx of new faces, people inspired by Marcus's leadership and determined to be part of the change. Blake became a regular at the meetings, often sitting quietly at first, listening to the stories of others. Over time, he began to share his own experiences, his own struggles with fear and bias. Each meeting chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, replacing them with bridges of understanding and trust. For Marcus, the experience reinforced what he had always believed: that change was possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but with patience, persistence, and compassion, even the most fractured communities could find a way to heal. And so, as the town of Maplewood moved forward, it carried with it the lessons of that day in the parking lot. A reminder that while the road to justice and equality was long, it was a journey worth taking together. A new chapter. Blake Thompson sat in his cruiser outside the outreach center a week later, staring at the flyer Marcus had handed him. It was crumpled from being folded and unfolded too many times, but the words on it still resonated. Building bridges. A community united. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. The parking lot wasn't crowded, but he recognized a few familiar faces from the workshop. For Blake, stepping into the center for the second time wasn't as daunting as the first. Something had shifted within him since that day in the parking lot. His instincts, once shaped by years of rigid thinking, now urged him to lean into discomfort, to seek understanding instead of control. He pushed the door open and walked inside. The second meeting. The atmosphere inside the outreach center was warm and welcoming. Chairs were arranged in a circle again, and the hum of conversation filled the room. Marcus stood near a bulletin board, talking to a few veterans about upcoming initiatives. When he saw Blake, his face lit up with a smile that carried both approval and encouragement. "You made it," Marcus said, extending his hand. Blake shook it firmly. "I told you I would." The meeting began with introductions, as before, but this time Blake felt less like an outsider. When his turn came, he spoke with more confidence. "I'm Officer Blake Thompson. Last week, I learned a hard lesson about how my actions affect the people I'm supposed to protect. I'm here because I want to do better, not just as a cop, but as a person." The room fell silent for a moment before a round of quiet applause rippled through the group. Marcus gave a small nod, his approval evident but unspoken. A challenge and a commitment. As the meeting progressed, the group discussed ways to address systemic issues in the community: police relations, support for veterans, and resources for those in need. Blake listened intently, his notebook open as he jotted down ideas and concerns. When the discussion turned to actionable steps, Marcus turned to Blake. "You've had a week to reflect," he said. "What do you think needs to change?" Blake hesitated but then spoke with conviction. "I think we need more moments like this," he said, gesturing to the group. "We need spaces where officers, veterans, and community members can talk openly, without judgment. But we also need training, real training, on how to handle situations like the one I mishandled. It can't just be about enforcing the law. It has to be about building trust." Marcus smiled. "That's a good start," he said. "Now, how do we make it happen?" The group brainstormed together, and by the end of the meeting, they had a list of proposals: workshops for law enforcement, partnerships between the outreach center and the police department, and regular town hall meetings to foster dialogue. Blake volunteered to take the proposals to his supervisor, knowing it wouldn't be an easy sell but determined to try. The turning point. Over the next few months, the initiatives began to take shape. Blake became an advocate for the outreach center, organizing joint events between the police department and the local community. Marcus was a constant presence, his leadership and wisdom guiding every step of the process. The changes weren't immediate, and there were setbacks along the way. Some officers resisted the new approach, while some community members remained skeptical of Blake's intentions. But as time went on, progress became undeniable. The workshops were well attended, and the conversations they sparked began to ripple through the town. Blake found himself growing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He became more patient, more empathetic, and more willing to admit when he was wrong. The badge he wore no longer felt like a shield, but a responsibility, a commitment to serve with integrity. A moment of recognition. 6 months after the parking lot incident, the town held a community event to celebrate the progress they had made. The outreach center had been transformed into a vibrant gathering space, filled with music, food, and laughter. Veterans mingled with police officers, children played on the lawn, and the air was filled with hope. At the center of it all stood Marcus and Blake, side by side. A local reporter approached them, microphone in hand. "Sergeant Brooks, Officer Thompson," she said, "this town has come a long way since that day in the grocery store parking lot. What message do you want people to take away from this moment?" Marcus glanced at Blake, then spoke first. "I want people to understand that change is possible, but it takes effort. It takes listening, learning, and a willingness to admit when you're wrong. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Blake nodded, his voice steady as he added, "And I want people to know that redemption isn't about forgetting the past. It's about learning from it. I made a mistake that day, but because of people like Marcus and this community, I've been given the chance to make things right. I'll spend the rest of my life earning that chance." The reporter smiled, lowering her microphone. The crowd around them erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the evening sky. For Marcus, it was a moment of quiet satisfaction, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could lead to profound change. For Blake, it was a symbol of how far he had come, and how far he still wanted to go. A legacy of change. As the sun set over the town, Marcus and Blake stood together, watching the community they had helped unite. Their journey wasn't over, but it was a testament to the power of accountability, forgiveness, and the human capacity for growth. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said quietly. Blake nodded, "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." Together, they turned back to the crowd, stepping into the future, not as adversaries, but as allies, united by a shared vision of hope and justice.